All right, let's jump right into this explainer, because today we are tearing apart one of the most famous paranormal legends out there to find the absolutely wild historical reality underneath. Now, if you're into the weird and unexplained, you've definitely heard of Kuldara. It's sitting right out there in the blistering heat of the Thar Desert in Rajasthan, and it's widely hyped as India's most haunted village. But you know what? The actual historical facts, the true story of the lost civilization that lived there, are way more mind-blowing than any spooky ghost story. So let's strip away the myths and get into some really fascinating facts.
But first, we gotta set the scene with the legend that put this place on the map. Picture this, it's 2013. A team of paranormal investigators is out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by ruins that have been totally abandoned for like 200 years. It's 2 a.m., and as they're packing up to leave, they look down at the dust-covered hood of their car, and boom, small handprints. Handprints that look exactly like they belong to a 4 or 5-year-old kid, and there is literally no one around for miles. Then, other journalists started reporting the exact same thing happening to their cars. Total horror movie stuff, right? Well, the local legend says that 2 centuries ago, this was a booming settlement until every single person, supposedly 80,000 of them, just vanished into thin air overnight. No noise, no trace, just gone.
So, what supposedly caused this mass vanishing? According to the folklore, it all comes down to one really bad guy. Back in the early 1800s, the local Diwan, basically the prime minister, was a guy named Salim Singh, and he was ruthless. Like absurd taxes, treating the king as a puppet, the whole shebang. The story goes that he set his sights on the village chief's daughter and gave the village an ultimatum: hand her over by tomorrow or I'm bringing my army to massacre everyone. The villagers, who were known as the Paliwal Brahmins, decided on a totally desperate move. Under the cover of darkness, the residents of Kuldahara and the 83 surrounding villages packed whatever they could and fled. And on their way out, they allegedly cursed the land, saying no one would ever be able to live in Kuldahara again.
I mean, it's a fantastic campfire story. You've got a terrifying villain, a daring midnight escape, a creepy curse. But let's hit pause on that for a second, because beyond the spooky myth lies an incredible historical reality that is honestly just so much cooler. The Paliwal Brahmins weren't just helpless victims in a ghost story. Actually, scratch that, they were absolute pioneers. They built an engineering marvel out there in the sand that scientists are still studying today. The sheer genius of these people is just wow. The Thar Desert is no joke. We're talking summer temperatures blasting past 50 degrees Celsius, which is over 120 Fahrenheit, and practically zero rain. Just sand dunes for days. Yet these villagers invented something called the Kadeen water harvesting system. They literally hacked the desert. They figured out how to use the natural slopes of the hills to catch the tiny bit of monsoon rain they'd get, and then they'd let it slowly soak deep underground. By winter, the top layer would evaporate, leaving behind incredibly rich, fertile soil. Think about that. They were growing 2 abundant crops a year in the middle of a scorching desert. They were banking, they were trading, and they actually got wealthier than the capital city of Jaisalmer.
So, when you put the folklore side by side with the actual historical facts, the whole overnight vanishing thing completely falls apart. The myth relies on the shock value of 80,000 people pulling off a giant vanishing act on a random night in 1825. But real life is rarely that dramatic, right? Official records from British officials who were stationed there at the time tell us a much different story. It wasn't magic, it was a gradual, really painful migration that took decades.
Let's look at the cold, hard census data, because numbers don't lie. At its absolute peak, Kuldara didn't have 80,000 people. It had maybe 1588. And here's the real kicker. A British officer named Colonel James Todd logged the population in 1815 at around 800 people. That is a full 10 years before the so-called cursed night. The population had already dropped by half, and it didn't just instantly flatline either. Even way later, in 1890, records show about 37 people were still hanging on, living in the ruins. So yeah, the whole overnight disappearance thing, totally busted.
Okay, so if it wasn't a curse, why did everyone actually leave? Well, it was basically a perfect storm of environmental and economic disasters. First, their lifeline, the Kakik River, got dammed upstream and dried up. No water meant their genius farming system completely failed. On top of that, the trade routes got super dangerous. Bandits were constantly raiding the village and kidnapping people. And yes, our villain Salim Singh was a real guy, and he was squeezing them dry with oppressive taxes. When they couldn't pay, he'd literally take their family members hostage. So facing starvation, bankruptcy, and constant violence, they didn't vanish by magic. They just made the incredibly hard, totally logical decision to migrate away to survive.
But hold on, if the history is that well documented, why are modern tourists and TV crews constantly seeing ghosts and hearing voices out there? To answer that, we've got to look at psychology. It all comes down to confirmation bias. If you travel all the way to a place that everybody calls India's most haunted village, your brain is already hyped up to find a ghost. You're actively hunting for anything that proves you're in a creepy place.
And then you mix that with pareidolia. We talk about this a lot. Our brains are basically pattern-matching machines. We're hardwired to find faces and familiar shapes and random noise. So you're walking through these ruins at night, totally terrified. Suddenly, a normal desert draft hits you, and your brain says, ghostly chill. Your camera battery dies because it's old, spirits draining the energy, and a weird smudge of blowing dust settles on your car. Your brain instantly connects the dots to make it look exactly like a creepy kid's handprint. The ghosts aren't in the ruins, they're literally just products of our own amazing imaginations.
But here is the absolute best part of this whole explainer. If the mass vanishing is fake and the ghosts are just psychological tricks, why did this specific legend get so huge? Like, who was actually benefiting from keeping people terrified of this random abandoned desert town? Think about it. Someone was actively pushing these rumors.
The answer to that didn't come out until 1998, and it is a massive plot twist. For decades, locals totally avoided the area. But in 1998, a local watchman who was camping out in the ruins woke up in the middle of the night, and he caught two foreigners, a Dutch guy and a German guy, sneaking around the old crumbling houses with heavy-duty metal detectors and shovels.
You guys, the haunting was a giant cover-up. Remember how I said the Paliwal Brahmins were insanely wealthy bankers? Well, when they slowly migrated away, they couldn't carry all their heavy gold and silver on foot, so they buried it under their floors hoping they'd come back for it one day. Over the years, thieves and international treasure hunters figured this out. But you can't exactly excavate a village if tourists and locals are walking around, right? So what do? You act like real-life Scooby-Doo villains. You aggressively spread a terrifying rumor about a cursed, haunted village so that everyone stays far, far away while you dig up the gold in the dark. Once those guys were busted in '98, the government finally realized what was happening and built a wall to protect the site.
Which brings us to the real takeaway here. Now that we know the numbers, the psychology, and the literal treasure hunters pulling the strings behind the myth, how should we look at Kuldara? Do we keep hyping up the fake ghost stories invented by thieves to cover up their crimes? Or do we start honoring the actual factual legacy of the Paliwal Brahmins? These were absolute geniuses who conquered a brutal desert and turned sand into an agricultural gold mine. I don't know about you, but I think the reality is way more fascinating than the myth. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep questioning the stories you hear, and I'll see